In 1939, 22 children at an Iowa orphanage were told they were getting speech therapy. What they actually got was psychological torture disguised as science. 6 of them, perfectly normal speakers, were relentlessly told they were stutterers. They were mocked for every tiny speech imperfection. They were criticized until they stopped talking altogether. And then, for 62 years, the whole thing was buried. The university called it research. The graduate students who knew about it called it something else, the monster study. This is the story of how one psychologist's desperate need to prove his theory destroyed innocent lives, and how the cover-up lasted longer than most of the victims did. Before we dive into one of psychology's darkest secrets, if you're new here, welcome to The Sleeping Psychologist, where I uncover the experiments and scandals you definitely slept through in your psych textbooks. This story was literally hidden for over 6 decades. If you don't want to sleep through the next one, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. And drop a comment. Do you think a scientist's personal struggle justifies experimenting on vulnerable children? All right, let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Stuttering Psychologist. Iowa City, 1926. A tall, gangly farm boy named Wendell Johnson arrives at the University of Iowa to study English. He's smart class president, valedictorian back in tiny Roxbury, Kansas. He's funny, well-liked, ambitious. He also can barely speak. Wendell Johnson stuttered so severely that he was often rendered completely speechless. Imagine being the smartest person in your graduating class, but unable to express a single thought out loud. That frustration pushed him toward writing, toward literature, toward humor. It also pushed him toward the University of Iowa, because in 1926, Iowa was the global headquarters for stuttering research. This was the golden age of psychology as a science. Researchers were trying to unlock the mysteries of the human mind using experiments, data, measurements. And stuttering was one of the biggest mysteries. About 1 in 100 people stutter. But why? What causes it? Can it be fixed? Young Johnson threw himself into the work. He switched from English to psychology. He and his fellow grad students, many of them stutterers too, used themselves as guinea pigs. They'd hook each other up to electrodes. They'd fire guns near each other's ears to see if being startled affected stuttering. It didn't. They'd put casts on their arms because some theory suggested immobilizing your dominant hand might untangle confused brain signals. At one point, 30 stutterers wandered the Iowa campus with their arms in plaster, playing wrong-handed badminton. They were obsessed. We weren't just puttering around on the fringes, one researcher said. We were working on something central to the life of a human being. By 1937, Johnson was an ambitious assistant professor with a theory. The dominant belief at Iowa was that stuttering had a physical cause, misdirected brain signals, some kind of neurological glitch. But Johnson's life story told him otherwise. He'd spoken perfectly fine until age 5 or 6. Then a teacher mentioned to his parents that he was starting to stutter, and gradually, obsession took over. He became self-conscious. He repeated sounds. He hesitated. The more he worried about it, the worse it got. This led Johnson to a radical conclusion. Stuttering wasn't biological. It was learned. It was psychological. It begins not in the child's mouth, he wrote, but in the parent's ear. He called this the diagnosogenic theory, the idea that the diagnosis itself causes the disorder. Parents notice normal childhood disfluencies, freak out, and accidentally condition their kids into full-blown stuttering through their reactions. If he was right, this would revolutionize speech therapy. But he needed proof. And proof meant one thing. If you could create a stutterer in a lab, you'd prove stuttering was learned behavior. Chapter 2. The Setup, Fall 1938. Johnson recruits one of his graduate students for the experiment that would define and haunt both their careers. Her name was Mary Tudor. She was 22 years old, eager to please, a little timid. Johnson pitched her the study. Could you make children stutter just by telling them they do? Think about that for a second. Not, can we help children who stutter? But, can we damage children who don't? That's the experiment. The University of Iowa had an ongoing relationship with an orphanage in Davenport, about 60 miles away, the Soldiers and Sailors Orphans Home. Founded after the Civil War to house children whose fathers died in battle. By 1939, it held over 600 orphans and demi-orphans kids whose parents were alive but too broke to care for them during the Great Depression. The home was spare, regimented, joyless. Kids woke at 5:30 a.m., cleaned until school started, marched everywhere in careful lines. Perfect conditions for an experiment, because these kids had no parents to question what was happening to them. On January 17, 1939, Mary Tudor drove to Davenport with her notepads, chalkboards, and a cumbersome dictaphone. She selected 22 children. None of them were told the real purpose. They thought they were getting speech therapy. Here's how the study was designed. 10 of the 22 kids were already labeled stutterers by teachers. Tudor split them into 2 groups. 5 were told, "You do not stutter. Your speech is fine." The other 5 were told, "Yes, your speech is as bad as people say." Those were the control groups. Then came the experimental groups. 12 children who spoke normally were chosen at random. 6 of them, Group IIBA, would be told their speech was great, easy enough. But 6 others, Group IIE, would become the monsters in the monster study. These kids, aged 5 to 15, would be told they were beginning to stutter, that they needed to stop immediately, that they were broken. Tudor tested their IQs, their handedness. There was still this weird theory that being left-handed caused stuttering, and then began the intervention. Every few weeks, she'd drive from Iowa City to Davenport and spend 45 minutes with each child, following a script Johnson had written. To the kids in II, and the normal speakers being told they stuttered, she said things like, "The staff has come to the conclusion that you have a great deal of trouble with your speech. You have many of the symptoms of a child who is beginning to stutter. You must try to stop yourself immediately. Use your willpower. Don't ever speak unless you can do it right." You see how name of severe stutterer stutters? Well, he undoubtedly started this very same way. Can you imagine hearing that as a 5-year-old? You think you're fine. Then an adult authority figure, someone you're supposed to trust, tells you you're defective, tells you to fix it, tells you everyone's watching. The experiment ran from January to May 1939. 5 months. 5 months of psychological abuse disguised as therapy. Chapter 3. The experiment, the effects were immediate and devastating. After just the second session, Tudor wrote about 5-year-old Norma Zhang-Pu. It was very difficult to get her to speak, although she spoke very freely the month before. A child who used to talk openly suddenly went silent. 9-year-old Betty Romp practically refuses to talk, researchers noted. Held hand or arm over eyes most of the time. Imagine that a little girl so ashamed of her own voice that she can't even look at people anymore. 15-year-old Hazel Potter, the oldest in the group, became much more conscious of herself, and she talked less. She started snapping her fingers in frustration. When asked why, she said, "Because I was afraid I was going to say I." She was monitoring every sound that came out of her mouth, terrified of being defective. 11-year-old Clarence Pfeiffer, described as chubby and diffident, started anxiously correcting himself mid-sentence. He'd stop and tell Tudor he was going to have trouble with words before he even said them. How did he know? The sound wouldn't come out. Feels like it's stuck in there. That's not stuttering. That's trauma. That's a child learning to fear his own voice. All 6 children's schoolwork fell off. One boy started refusing to recite in class entirely. 12-year-old Mary Korleski became withdrawn and fractious. Tudor asked if her best friend knew about her stuttering. Mary muttered, "No. Why not?" She shuffled her feet. "I hardly ever talk to her. A 12-year-old cutting herself off from her best friend because she's been told she's broken. 2 years later, Mary Koleski ran away from the orphanage. She ended up at the rougher industrial school for girls. In 2003, when a reporter called her, by then Mary Nixon, 76 years old, she said, "I couldn't never tell my husband about it. It just ruined my life." Her voice broke. "I can't talk no more," she said, and hung up. These weren't just behavioral changes. These were identity changes. These kids started seeing themselves as damaged, as freaks, as people who couldn't be trusted to speak. And Mary Tudor? She wasn't untouched either. Even after the study officially ended in May 1939, she went back to the orphanage 3 times to try to undo the damage. She told the kids they didn't stutter after all, but the damage was done. In a letter to Johnson, dated April 22, 1940, she wrote, emphasis hers, "I believe that in time they will recover, but we certainly made a definite impression on them." That's one way to put it. Another way? You traumatized the 6 vulnerable children for science. Here's the kicker. The experiment failed. None of the 6 kids in Group II actually became stutterers. Their speech fluency ratings barely changed. 2 even improved slightly. What changed was their behavior. They looked like stutterers, the shuffling, the whispering, the finger snapping, the self-consciousness. But they didn't stutter, because Johnson's theory was wrong. You can't create a stutterer by labeling them one. Stuttering isn't purely learned, but you can destroy a child's confidence, self-worth, and willingness to speak. That, it turns out, is pretty easy. Chapter 4. The Dark Term. So what did Wendell Johnson do when his grand experiment failed to prove his theory? When the data showed he'd traumatized children for nothing, he buried it. Mary Tudor submitted her completed master's thesis in August 1939 with a dedication to Johnson, and then it vanished. Johnson, who regularly helped his students publish their work and who meticulously documented every stuttering study at Iowa, never published Tudor's thesis. He never included it in his comprehensive indexes of University of Iowa stuttering research. He acted like it didn't exist. But it did exist, and some people knew about it. The thesis sat in the university library, technically available but never discussed. Iowa speech pathology grad students whispered about it. Those who had heard about it nicknamed it the monster study. Remembers Franklin Silverman, a professor who became Johnson's student years later. It reminded people of the Nazi experiments on human subjects. The other professors at the time told him it would ruin his reputation to publish the data. Think about that comparison. The Nazi experiments. That's how Johnson's own colleagues saw it. And yet, nothing happened. No consequences, no investigation, just silence. Here's what makes it even darker. Johnson occasionally referenced the study in lectures, claiming it had successfully caused an orphan, probably Hazel Potter, to stutter, thus proving his diagnosogenic theory. But that was a lie. The researcher's final evaluation graded Hazel a non-stutterer. Johnson twisted his own failed experiment into propaganda for his theory. In 1959, he published Onset of Stuttering, a famous book laying out the diagnosogenic theory in detail. Nowhere in its pages does he mention the monster study. Not once. It should have been discussed, says Gerald Zimmerman, a former Iowa speech professor. It should have been part of the record. Maybe everyone would have supported the theory anyway. Johnson was persuasive, but at least a question would have been raised. Instead, from the 1950s until the early 1980s, Johnson's theory became the foundation of childhood speech therapy in America. Therapists, believing the diagnosis could worsen stuttering, refused to work directly with young stuttering children. They'd only counsel parents, telling them to stop worrying so much. Sometimes it helped. Other times, kids who needed direct intervention got nothing. We can't know how many stuttering children were poorly served because Johnson suppressed data that contradicted his theory. But it's worth asking, why did he do it? Oliver Bloodstein, Johnson's most distinguished student, wrote, "Like most stutterers, he was baffled by his stuttering. He spent hours trying to figure out what he was doing that made him stutter." Johnson's entire career, his identity, was built on solving the mystery of his own condition. Admitting he was wrong would have meant admitting his suffering had no clear explanation, that the thing that defined his entire life remained inexplicable. So he buried the evidence. And 6 orphans carried the scars. Chapter 5. The Aftermath. For 62 years, the monster study stayed hidden. The orphans grew up never knowing they'd been experimented on. They just knew something was wrong with them. They struggled with speech anxiety, with self-esteem, with trust. They thought it was their fault. Wendell Johnson died in 1965 of a massive heart attack at age 59, still defending his diagnosogenic theory. He was writing an entry on speech disorders for Encyclopedia Britannica when he died. The essay, published posthumously, brooks no dissent. The child learns speech-disruptive behavior as he tries to keep from stuttering, he wrote, never acknowledging the study that contradicted everything. The University of Iowa named its Speech and Hearing Disorders Institute after him. His legacy was secure. Then, in June 2001, investigative reporter Jim Dyer of the San Jose Mercury News published a 10,000-word expose titled Ethics and Orphans, the Monster Study. The story went national. Suddenly, the experiment everyone in Iowa speech pathology had whispered about was front-page news. The 3 surviving victims from Group I, Enorma Zhang Pu, now Catherine Meacham, Mary Korleski, now Mary Nixon, and Hazel Potter, now Hazel Dornbush, learned for the first time what had been done to them. Mary Nixon, by then a 76-year-old widow living in a retirement home, had spent her entire life believing she had a speech problem. She was reclusive, insecure. She'd never told her husband. "It just ruined my life," she told a reporter before hanging up. Catherine Meacham, 70, had thought of herself as a freak all her life. She hated talking except to family and a few people at her church. "She's a sad, sad lady," her lawyer said. Hazel Dornbush, 79, was the fighter. "Imagine trying to wreck a little child's voice," she said. "But I've moved on. I married a good man. I talk okay." Then she paused, puzzled. "I don't really remember being that close to any other children at the orphanage. But back then, I was quiet." In 2003, the 3 survivors and the estates of 3 deceased victims sued the state of Iowa and the University of Iowa for millions of dollars, citing infliction of emotional distress and fraudulent misrepresentation. The university issued an apology, but the state also asked a judge to dismiss the case, claiming immunity under 1939 law. On August 17, 2007, 68 years after the experiment began, the state of Iowa agreed to pay $925,000 to settle the lawsuit, about $150,000 per victim. The price of a life. Chapter 6. Modern Implications. So what did we learn? Or more accurately, what should we have learned 80 years ago? First, the science. Modern research shows Johnson was partly right and mostly wrong. There is a genetic component to stuttering, a biological predisposition. Not everyone with stuttering genes develops the disorder, though. Environmental factors matter. A parent's panicked reaction might push a vulnerable child over the edge. So Johnson's theory partially survives. But as the sole explanation, completely debunked. No one believes anymore that only your parents make you stutter, says Robert Goldfarb, head of the PhD program in speech sciences at CUNY. It's probably a shame that anyone ever did. Second, the ethics. The monster study violated every principle of modern research ethics. No informed consent. No parental permission. Vulnerable subjects, orphans with no advocates. Deliberate psychological harm. No follow-up care. Active cover-up of results. Would this study be approved today? Not in a million years. But here's the uncomfortable part. It wasn't just Johnson. His colleagues knew. Grad students called it the monster study. University officials knew. And for 62 years, no one said anything publicly. That's not one bad actor. That's institutional rot. The case also raises questions about scientific legacy. Johnson was a pioneer. He wrote groundbreaking books, helped thousands of stutterers, advanced speech pathology as a discipline. Does the monster study erase all of that? The 6 children in Group II never got footnote status. They got lifelong trauma. They got $150,000 settlements 7 decades too late. They got to be collateral damage in one man's quest to understand himself. That's the real legacy of the monster study, and it's one we slept through for 62 years. Hazel Dornbush said something haunting when she was interviewed in 2003. "Don't really remember being that close to any other children," she said, talking about the orphanage. "But back then, I was quiet." She didn't connect the dots, that maybe she was quiet because a graduate student spent 5 months convincing her something was wrong with her voice. That her isolation, her inability to form close friendships even as a child, might have been caused by an experiment she didn't know she was part of. The monster study reminds us that science without ethics is just cruelty with a lab coat. If you want more stories like this, the ones textbooks leave out, you know what to do. Subscribe to The Sleeping Psychologist, hit the bell, and drop a comment. What's the most unethical psychology experiment you've ever heard of?